are quite different. So they're all about, this is National Careers Week, which I think has probably been overshadowed a bit by it's also International Women's Month, obviously other events going on in the world. So I've not seen lots of people talking about National Careers Week, but we thought it would be interesting to just do some different sorts of conversations to give people insights into different kinds of careers. So that's the purpose of the conversations this week, just to do something a bit different. Next week's episode is sort of back to normal, and it's Helen and I talking about people pleasing next week. But I thought this quote was probably quite a good description of what we often do when we talk to our guests, the conversations that we're having. We're sort of giving them the time and the space to think about where they've been and what they've done and what they've learnt. And a lady called Michelle McGrath, who's sort of one of my long-term mentors, introduced me to this quote where she says, life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. And Soren Kierkegaard, I'm not sure if I'm saying his name right, but he's, as you can imagine, he's like a philosopher, apparently an existentialist philosopher. I was just double checking this morning exactly what he did. And I was thinking, how do you do this? So most of us don't get the opportunity to go on a podcast and have a conversation where we reflect all about our career so far. And I always find this next tool that we're going to talk through really useful. So I thought I'd talk through a tool that will help you to reflect on your career so far. So understanding backwards, but then think about the so what moving forwards. How do we use this tool to then inform what we do and where our career could take us? And some of you might have seen us talk about this before. Certainly if you've read Squiggly, you probably recognize it. And this is the idea of doing a bit of a squiggly line to reflect the highs and the lows of your careers so far. And I think there are a few different ways of doing this, and doing this in a few different ways will get you more self-awareness. I think you can do this in a very zoom out way, and you can do it in a very zoom in way. So I'm going to give you 3 different examples of using exactly the same tool with a different lens, looking at it through a different lens, really, really zooming out and then progressively zooming in, which is not something that we've talked about before, but we've both found really, really helpful. Oh, it's your first podcast. Well, at least you are getting to see a tool. They are slightly different to normal, but everyone will get involved and help on chat, I'm sure. So the first way of thinking about this career graph is just thinking about your career as a whole and really plotting the highs, the lows, the in-between moments, and what that would look like for you. And for some people, that might be 2 years worth of work. For some people, that might be 42 years worth of work. And you definitely can't do this as quickly as I'm about to do this. This is a really good, take half an hour over coffee, over a cup of tea, and really think about this. But if I was to draw mine pretty quickly, it would look something like this. So I had my kind of first job. Then I had, I'm going to do this by job, just to make it easier for me to remember. That was my second job. Then sort of here. Then I sort of was here for a bit. Then it was a bit like that. Then maybe a bit like that. And then like that. And I'm just trying to think what happened then. Then probably a bit more like this. Then like that. Then probably like this. You're desperate trying to remember what happened. Then probably a bit like that. And there you go, roughly. And everybody's career graph sort of looks squiggly because no one's graph goes like this. No one goes, oh yeah, it's sort of all been a pretty straight line, to be honest. Like everything's gone well, everything's gone to plan, straight line to success. So everyone has highs, everyone has lows. And it's not that as we go through, we expect to always stay above the line. We don't sort of go, oh, well, as we get older, we always get wiser, because there's always things outside of our control. We know that in squiggly careers, there's always uncertainty. There are always other factors that can influence our experience. I think what this is useful for is, I think when you take the time to look back, first of all, I think you start to see, when you think about what you can learn from the highs. So what do your highs have in common? And also, what can you learn from your lows? What we usually see is that your highs are when you're using your strengths and living your values, and your lows tend to be when you are having to worry about your weaknesses, and your values are either in conflict in some way or missing. So the first way I think this is useful, this exercise, and we'll get to the questions in a bit together, is it's a good shortcut. It's not the only thing we'd want to do, but it's a good shortcut to increasing your self-awareness about strengths and values. And again, if you're trying to do this quite quickly, I always think of strengths are more about what you do and values are more about who you are. So if you do this exercise, look at the spiky bits, both the lows and the highs, and just think about what do those things have in common and what can you learn from those things. And I knew by this point and this point, I knew my values and my strengths really well. I'd done a lot of this work. So as I said, that doesn't mean that those lows don't happen at certain moments, but perhaps something unexpected happens, or you make the best choice you can with the information that you have and something changes, or it doesn't quite work out as you planned. I do think the more you know about yourself, the more likely you are, though, to enjoy and get meaning from the kind of choices that you make, from where your career could take you. So I think the first way to use this is look across all of your career and then think about strengths and values. The second way to use this is I think it is helpful to think about, based on what you notice when you do this exercise, when you reflect on your career so far, what are your career criteria? And when we say career criteria, to make this really specific, and it's good to challenge ourselves to think in this way, I like to distinguish between what are my must-haves and what are my nice-to-haves. And when I say must-haves, these are the things that you really need to be true to enjoy the work that you do. They really challenge yourself to think, are they must-haves or are they nice-to-haves? Our list of must-haves is at certain points where I check my internet for a sec because it looks like it's gone a bit unstable. You still hear me okay, Lucy? Yep, cool. One of my must-haves for a few years was definitely working a 4-day week. And it was an absolute must-have for me. So that's a really practical point. And that was because I was spending a day a week on Amazing If. And you know that it's a must-have when, if you're challenged on it, you make the choice based on your must-have. So I got offered a really good job that was a 5-day a week job. And they'd said to me on the way along the interview process, yeah, of course, 4-day week's fine. And then they said, here's the job, but you can only have the job if you work a 5-day week. And that feels really hard to turn down, because I remember thinking, this is a good job and this is interesting and I'd like to do this job. But if that 4-day week is a real must-have for me, and I knew I would be happier if I also had some time to spend on Amazing If, you turn down that job. So for ages, a 4-day week was a must-have for me. Now I work a 5-day week, and I don't want to work a 4-day week anymore. That's not a must-have for me. But at that moment, I might think, oh, maybe that's a nice to have. Maybe in the future I would like to work a 4-day week again. But at the moment, I think, well, I definitely have enough to do to fill 5 days, and also I really enjoy the work that I'm doing. So those must-haves and those nice-to-haves change, and really sort of think about, this helps you a bit with compromises and choices. One of the things that we know is that when we are conscious about our compromises and our choices, we feel very differently about them versus if they happen to us. So, we might make a compromise about industry, or about who we're working for, or about salary, any of the different things that come with the jobs that we do and the choices that we make. But when we've sort of been an active part of that decision-making process, when we have thought, okay, well, I'm prepared to trade off X for Y, or this feels more important than that, then we have a very different relationship with it. I remember, so here, I was definitely having, just put it into context, here, I was definitely having a low moment, but I was very clear about why I had taken that job and what I was gaining and learning from that role. And so even though it didn't quite work out as I'd anticipated, some of that was personal stuff, some of that was professional stuff, I had got a very clear sense of, what was going to be true as a result of that experience, what experiences I was gaining, what was still good about it. And though I wasn't necessarily enjoying it, like day in, day out, I probably wasn't enjoying it as much as I'd anticipated, I think I found my way through that because I'd been very clear about why that felt like the right thing for me at that moment. So though it felt hard, it felt doable. That whole thing of doable and difficult. Let me just check chat. Okay, So hopefully that's a good starting point. I think a good way to do, so this is zoom out. We have zoomed out. We're reflecting on all of our career so far. We're doing that. Let's understand our career, not our whole life, our career backwards, to think about strengths and values and this idea of career criteria, must-haves versus nice-to-haves. Then what you can do is start to zoom in a little bit more. Two ways that you could do this. You can take a time period. So what you could do is take a significant time period that's quite recent. So if I think about the start of 2020, so that's just pre-pandemic, that's when Squiggly Career came out, our first book, till today, that's been a really significant period. That's been the first time that I've been full-time in Amazing If. So I could take that period, and essentially what I'm doing is, so let's work out roughly where this would be. That is, let's say, sort of roughly here. So I'm taking this part of my zoomed out and I'm in more. I'm sort of looking for more nuance, and I'm starting to think, okay, so what are the things that happened over the past couple of years? What are those highs and lows? I'm going to drill down a little bit more into the detail. So again, I'll do it very quickly, but start of 2020 was awesome. I really enjoyed that. I did not enjoy the pandemic starting at all. Living with my parents for 10 weeks, not that fun, but it was okay. And then we were sort of okay-ish here for a while. And then it sort of went like that. And then if I was to do that, there's probably been a bit there. And then something like that. So you've just drilled in again. And this is where you'll start to ask some of the questions that we'll come up with together. This is where you'd start to ask yourself some coach yourself questions. Okay, so what can I learn from the lows? Who helped me in the hard moments? What did I not do that in hindsight would have been helpful? So what did you do? What did you not do? Is there anything you do differently? I've not read it yet, but Dan Pink's new book, which I have got on my desk at the moment, is about regret. And it's really interesting because I think his work, from the summary that I've read about it, he's trying to encourage us to have a different relationship with regret. So rather than being relentlessly positive, which is never that useful, we also don't want to see regrets as something unhelpful, because you can't change it. We know we can't change the past. And he's quite interesting because he sort of looked at how can we change our relationship with regret so it's actually useful for us. Okay, good question, Serena. I'll come back to that in a sec. And so I think this is quite interesting to think, well, what would I have done differently? And therefore, how can that inform what I might then do in the future? It's not about beating yourself up about things going wrong. It's just about learning from them. You know that when we think about the relationship we have with mistakes, it's not about thinking, I'm going to stop making mistakes, because everybody makes mistakes. Everyone will have those low things. It's about thinking, what did I learn? So that we're just in that kind of infinite learning curve that we're aiming for. The other exercise I think is really helpful to do here is just think about spheres of control. So I know that some of you will know this, but when you are thinking particularly about those lows, be really clear about what was in your control and what was what's often described as in your circle of concern. And particularly if you're looking over the last 2 years, there's quite a few things where you think maybe it influenced you having a low moment or a tough time, but in hindsight there is nothing you could have done about it. So we can't learn anything personally that useful from that. But you might think a bit about, well, how did you respond to that setback? That might be learning. So just make sure, I think, that we're focusing over here on what we can control. So to Serena's question, sort of saying to me, if Amazing If's one of your highs, but you still experience a low, how do you know you're in the right place? I think it's because, so we all know there's highs and lows every day, every week. I think it's when you then look back over a week or a month, do you feel like your time at work is well spent? So do you feel like you're having a positive impact, making a positive difference? Which I always do with Amazing If. Are you kind of connected to the work that you do, and do you care about it? So do I care about making careers better for everyone? That sort of our ultimate purpose. I'm very connected to that, and I really care about that. And so what that means is then when there are those hard moments, which are inevitable, the thing that helps you to kind of find your way through is thinking, well, I'm still very committed to what we do and why we do it. Also, the people that you work with makes a really big difference when you're kind of having those tough times, and those people help you through those moments. And I think I still reflect about my strengths and my values, back to our previous point. Do I feel like I'm using my strengths and living my values? And that's, again, that's not a constant. I don't think, oh, I use all of my strengths all of the time and live all of my values every day. But my 4 values are achievement, ideas, learning, and variety. And I probably live those values more now than I ever have in any job I've ever done. So that's doesn't matter that it's Amazing If or that it's my own business, but I feel those values are more present than they've ever been. And my strengths are around creating new ideas, building good strategic relationships, hopefully becoming increasingly a credible expert in career development. And I get to use all of those things pretty frequently. But there are definitely moments where I don't use some of my strengths as much as I would like, because sometimes that's not what your business needs in those moments. So I think it's also getting away from or letting go of the idea that there is any such thing as a perfect job or a perfect role. But I do think there are things that feel like a much better fit for us and for what's important to us. And then you're really clear sometimes about those trade-offs, back to that point about the relationship you have with your choices. Could I make more money in a different job? Absolutely. Definitely. Could I have a job that would have potentially much higher status? Probably. Are there some advantages to working in big organizations, which is where I spent most of my career? Definitely. And I really enjoyed working in those big organizations. So it's not saying other things are wrong. It's sort of what's the most right for you right now. And I think that is all you can do, is what's most right for you right now. Yeah, that's good. That's a good point, Steve. Actually, that's a good connecting the dots that Steve has done, when that is the Resilience podcast where I think maybe where I interviewed Dr. Bill Mitchell, and he talked to me about the difference between overwhelm and overload. And I found that really helpful. Yeah, that's the one. So overwhelm was where you feel like you've got too much to do and you can't see your way through it. You sort of can't, you feel out of control. Overload is where I've got loads to do, but I sort of feel confident I can find my way through it. Like we all feel, I've got a lot to do. There's a lot on the to-do list. There's always sort of, you're never going to be done, but you sort of get used to that feeling and feeling confident that you will together find your way through. But overwhelm is where you don't. So for anyone who listened to the Christmas episodes where I talked about having a bit of a meltdown on Clapham Junction Station, which by now people talk to me about all the time, because I think quite a lot of people heard that episode, that is overwhelm. That is a really, really good example of me getting overwhelmed and then sort of losing the ability to even explain what was happening or the help that I needed. So useful just to think about those. So again, another lens to look at your career through, a bit more short term than that first one. And the last 2 years, we hope, will never happen again, but it does probably give you some interesting insights. You've probably got some new insights about your career that you didn't have before. And then what you can do is go even shorter. So if we've zoomed out initially and then we zoomed in a bit more, and then you could really zoom in and just go this year so far. So you've got even more granular. So this would be for me. So we're probably looking now sort of here. So again, you're sort of taking apart and then you're expanding it. And I go, well, what's happened so far this year? And again, you start to go, well, if you look here, that's kind of that circle of concern rather than circle of control. Can't really help getting COVID. Just one of those things that happens. Can't really help the fact that happened 2 days or 1 day before our book launch in London. Those kind of things where you go, you sort of have to, it was a low moment, so you've got to acknowledge that, but you've sort of got to let go of, you couldn't, there's nothing really you could have done differently. But what you did do, what I definitely learned to do, was how do you deal with disappointment? So that was my learning there, was don't try and beat myself up for that thing happening. But what I can learn is, well, how did I find my way through probably a level of disappointment that I'd not felt before in my career? And then thinking about Manchester, which was then a real high point. And then you can start to get really specific about, oh, okay, so what happened there? What happened there? Why do you get the sort of the mini peaks and troughs? So question for all of you, and then I've got some examples. If you then do this exercise, so if you're doing 1, 3, 5 career graphs, as I've just described, what kind of questions, coach yourself questions, do you think would be useful to ask as a result of doing that career graph. So we then do the bit about, well, let's now make it useful for the future. So we've reflected, we've gone backwards. How do we make that then helpful for the future? Let me know in chat and let's see how many questions we can come up with. I think I came up with 5 to get us started, but I'll kind of do it after you. So let me know. Lovely question, Steve. Yeah, what do I know now that I didn't know then? What am I like at my best? Lucy, perfect, really good strengths question there. Great, Sarah. Really like that internal, external factors. I think that links really well to the control thing. And that's another good way of saying it. Yeah, was this me or my feelings? The whole assumptions versus facts. Am I making assumptions about this, or were they the objective facts? What roles match your strengths and values? I'm perfect. Yeah, really good question. Yeah, love that, Hayley. What have you learned from your lows? I think I had that as one of my ones. That's a really nice one. What were your main drivers from lows to high? Love that. What have I learned? How have I grown? Yeah, that'd be interesting, Serena. When have I grown the most? Or when did I learn the most? Sometimes those moments are quite uncomfortable. They might feel quite spiky, quite up and downy. If I think about when I learned the most, when I went into corporate responsibility, that wasn't easy. That was quite uncomfortable. And I didn't have a brilliant relationship with that manager initially. So if I really had zoomed into that, I nearly left that job. But I definitely learned the most. And then I really loved that job. But I had 6 months of quite a lot of up and down. Really nice. Active choices. That's a really nice question, Maria. So did you act, that point about conscious compromises, and I was talking about your relationship with the choices that you make. Did you do that? Or do you feel like, I definitely have moments in my career where I felt people were telling me what to do and where to go, and I just nodded along and thought they know better than me and didn't really do the hard work for myself. Love that, Christine. That's a good deep question. Was it my truth or the truth? Very good. Jeanette, love that. How did I reach out to people? Did I connect with others? I really like having a question about other people in there. I got one of those in a second. Is there an influence in your life? What can I apply going forwards? Oh, love that. Who can I share these insights with? So not only making this useful for you, making this useful for other people. Really good question. Squiggly careers, everyone's a learner, everyone's a teacher. Great question for that. Leon, really love that. You've been learning about the context that you create in your head versus the reality of how other people see you. Yeah, we sometimes talk about the idea of this fly on the wall. So you sort of experience your own situation in one way, and it feels very real for us. It's so interesting to then ask to try and either be your own fly on the wall to see yourself very objectively, or to ask other people to just see how clearly do you see yourself. That's often because we are our own worst critics. So we see ourselves more negatively, often, most frequently, than how other people see us. Oh, I love that. What were you scared to do then that you can do now? Brilliant question. Do I have any regrets yet? I'm going to say I've not read Dan Pink's new book yet, but it is on my list. So some of the questions that I'd got, I think nice to ask about, like, who has had a positive impact on my career, and why have they had a positive impact? I think thinking about the people that influence those highs and lows, and that might be some personal, some professional, could be quite nice. When I did that, I realized I've thought about it a few times, but I definitely chose some roles very consciously, more about who I was going to be working for than what I was going to be working on. And for me, that was a really good decision. And that was a conscious decision of a few times thinking, I want to go and learn from that person. It's also, if you think about it, a riskier decision because you can't control that person. They might get a new job. That also did happen to me. So it's got to be more than that. But I think it is a good question to ask yourself. Love that, Tara. How can I make sure I've got the right people around me? The radiators, not the drains, the supporters, not the detractors. So think about other people. We've talked about what you can learn from a low. No one, we don't sort of say this very often, but I think it's an interesting question. Where have you had the most fun? Like when were you just having loads of fun? And that might be a project, that might be a job. And like, what was it that made something fun? And whether fun's the right word, I don't, it might not be a word that we would all use to do with work, but there are times where I think we feel like we're either finding our flow or having fun or just sort of enjoying the work that we do. Like what did that look like? Flow might be another good question. We've talked about kind of what did your highs have in common? Maybe a good why question, quite a hard one, but looking at the job you're doing now, like, why am I doing the job I'm doing today? What's the answer to that question for yourself? We know from Tasha Urich's work on self-awareness, why questions always feel more confronting than what questions. So that feels like quite a confronting question, I think, to ask ourselves, like, why am I doing the job I'm doing today? But you're only asking yourself. You don't have to ask other people that. And it's good to know the answers to that, because back to that point about the relationship we have with the role that we're doing, it's back to this point about being conscious. When I said to you I had that sort of difficult moment it was relatively recently, a couple of years ago, I was so clear about why I was doing that role. It really helped me to find my way through some of the tough times that I probably hadn't anticipated. So kind of that why question is a good one. But sometimes just if you feel like they are quite tough questions, that's because why are traditionally harder than what. So maybe using the 5 W's and the H. After you have done your career graph or graphs, depending on how much you're going to zoom in and zoom out, try and ask yourself a who, what, why, where, when, and how question. So try and ask yourself 6 questions using the five W's and 1 H. If you use any of those, you're guaranteed to ask yourself open questions, which is always what we want when we're doing coach yourself questions. Make sure you ask yourself 1 question at once. So ask and then answer. Do question sequencing, not question stacking, to give yourself the most insight and awareness. And make sure you're asking I questions. What did I learn? Who helped me to succeed in that role? So that we are very much focusing on our kind of circle of control rather than circle of concern. Sarah, is it okay to think this is a moment in time, a role to learn from? Yeah, absolutely. A role to learn from, not necessarily to love. I think Brené Brown talked about that before, about going, know why you are here right now. And that might be just because you think, I just need to broaden my experience for a bit. And it's not my absolute love, but it sort of does the job for now. A brilliant mentor said to me, which is probably a good place to finish, when I was overthinking and over reflecting on what role to do next, he just said to me, but Sarah, you talk about squiggly careers and you know that your next job is not going to be your last job. So it is okay to think this is a job to learn from, not to love, or this is a job that's going to stretch my skills, or this is a job because I want to go and learn from that person. And so I think that next job is not going to be your last job is a good thing to always remember, particularly maybe if we're not in that real high that we'd like to be. So I hope that felt helpful. I was sort of trying to figure out where was a useful place to go today based on the podcast this week. And so I thought maybe just those zoom out, zoom ins, career graphs might be useful. Make sure you do the so what coach yourself questions. And we will see you next week to talk about people pleasing.